Abraham Lincoln observed in 1864, that while everyone declares for liberty, they don't all mean the same thing.
That's a powerful starting point.
It really is. And that idea, this contested meaning of freedom, is exactly what we're digging into today.
Specifically in Barbour County, Alabama.
Right. Using Jefferson Cowie's Freedom's Dominion to see how this concept played out, how it was fought over in one particular place over time.
It's a fascinating local lens on a huge national issue.
And much like the Mindful Moments YouTube channel uses AI for these thoughtful book analyses that make you think. Our goal here is similar, to encourage critical thinking about what freedom actually means.
It's striking, then, how that new Alabama governor's speech, the one Cowie mentions, immediately dives into Barbour County specifics.
Yeah, defending enduring independence from federal forces.
Right near MLK's old church, with attendees wearing white carnations, symbols of resistance to integration. The context is just right there.
And Barbour County itself, geographically. Rich soil, cotton, but also divided.
Very divided. You had the wealthy plantation areas and then the poorer region where George Wallace was born. That shapes everything.
And this idea of freedom, it gets complicated fast.
Yeah.
Patterson's concept is crucial here.
Yes, that freedom isn't just not being enslaved, but it can also mean the power to enslave.
That really reframes things. It connects these claims of American freedom directly to discrimination, to white supremacy, even violence.
So when the federal government stepped in, opposing what local white communities saw as their right to rule.
It wasn't just seen as a political disagreement.
No, it was framed as an attack on their freedom. Federal attempts to protect minority rights were called, tyranny.
We see that really early on, don't we, back in the 1830s in Barbour County?
Absolutely. Federal troops trying to remove white settlers from Creek land guaranteed by treaty.
But the settlers saw it as violating their freedom, their right to access land, that whole Jeffersonian ideal.
Which led to the county and the state basically teaming up against the feds. Early talk of nullification, even secession.
Nullification, meaning a state could just ignore a federal law.
Essentially, yes, if they deemed it unconstitutional. It's a core states' rights argument appearing very early.
And the Creek perspective during this. Their pleas to the War Department are heartbreaking.
They describe being surrounded, threatened, unable to work their land, but determined to stay. Freedom for them meant staying on their land. Self-determination.
A completely different understanding of freedom and rights.
Totally different. And this sets the scene for Andrew Jackson.
Jackson, quite a figure. His background fighting Native Americans, the British, it all feeds into his policies.
Right. His inauguration was popular with many, but there was definitely anxiety about his plans for native lands.
Which leads to the Indian removal policy, the Treaty of Cusseta in 32.
Where the Creeks give up their Alabama lands for individual plots and, ironically, federal protection from white settlers.
Protection that often didn't materialize. And the Creeks saw states' rights for what it was to them.
A tool for oppression. They couldn't get justice in Alabama's courts.
Then there's that incident with the intruder, Owens.
Oh, yeah. Threatening the Creeks, Deputy Marshal Austell tries to arrest him. Owens's cabin explodes.
And Austell tells the Creeks they can use force if Owens comes back. Wild.
It shows the breakdown of law. And when Owens is eventually killed...
The reaction just poured fuel on the fire, didn't it? Sectional tensions flared.
Exactly. Was Owens a martyr against federal tyranny, or was the government just upholding the law? Depends entirely on who you asked.
It's interesting to contrast this with Jackson's stance on nullification elsewhere.
Right. He was fiercely against South Carolina challenging federal tariffs.
But Alabama's Governor Gale, initially pro-union, eventually sided with state sovereignty when it came to the Creek lands.
It shows how states' rights was often a convenient argument used strategically.
And Deputy Marshal Austell just trying to do his job amidst threats.
It really highlights that paradox of dominating freedom, as Cowie puts it.
Yeah.
Federal agents facing violence while trying to protect Native Americans under treaty.
So the Creeks are forced out. What happens next in Barbour County?
A huge influx of settlers hungry for cotton land and, crucially, enslaved people to work it.
To the point where, by 1858, the county had a majority African-American population.
And the value of those enslaved people was enormous. About $8 million then. That's a massive economic stake in the system.
Nationally, politics tried to keep a lid on the slavery expansion issue, right? Balancing power in Congress.
Trying to, yeah. But things like California becoming a free state, the Compromise of 1850, they destabilized it.
Especially the Fugitive Slave Act.
Definitely. And you see the local Eufaula newspaper changing its name to Spirit of the South. Secession talk starts bubbling up.
And people were just talking, like
Yeah.
Jefferson Buford from Eufaula.
Right, urging folks to send armed men to Kansas to swing the vote on slavery there.
They knew the future of slavery hinged on westward expansion.
Meanwhile, you have poor white soldiers later in the Civil War feeling like it's a rich man's war, poor man's fight.
But Lincoln saw the core issue clearly. Liberty meaning self-rule versus liberty meaning
The power to own another person, to control their labor. Two fundamentally opposed ideas using the same word.
after the Civil War, the fight over freedom's meaning just intensifies.
Dramatically. For Black people, freedom often meant closeness to federal power, protection. For white Southerners, it meant distance from it.
Emancipation itself often required federal action that went beyond the usual constitutional boundaries.
But freedmen weren't just passive recipients. They had resources, especially solidarity.
Forming groups like the Loyal Leagues.
Exactly. To push for political and economic rights, build institutions. And they were vocal, like that petition from Alabama's Black citizens about ongoing abuse from planters.
This constant struggle, needing to engage with history and different viewpoints, it reminds you of platforms like Mindful Moments in our podcasts, right? That need for critical engagement.
It does. And the Freedmen's Bureau in Eufaula saw that firsthand. Huge demand for schools from freedmen.
Met with resistance. Schoolhouse burnings.
Yeah. And even then, the need for child labor at harvest time still pulled kids out of school. Economic reality hitting hard.
Then comes the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery.
A huge deal, but passed in unique circumstances. Lincoln called it a king's cure. But even then...
Planters pushed back immediately. President Johnson helped them regain power. Some states even refused to ratify it initially.
Which is why the 14th Amendment became so important, expanding federal power to protect rights against the states.
Though its full impact took time.
Definitely. Look at the Alabama Constitution vote in 1868. White voters boycotted it. It failed.
And the federal government had to step in again to change the rules just to get it passed.
It just shows how much federal, sometimes coercive power was needed to advance Black rights during Reconstruction.
But that federal presence wouldn't last. Reconstruction starts to retreat.
You even see figures like Eli Shorter, a former Confederate congressman from Eufaula, backing Horace Greeley for president in '72.
Greeley, a former abolitionist editor, why?
Primarily to end federal occupation. An alliance of convenience to get the troops out, even with a former enemy.
That 1872 election sounds complicated. Liberal Republicans and Democrats on one ticket.
Yeah, a fusion ticket. White Southerners mostly wanted federal troops gone. African Americans mostly stuck with the regular Republicans, who they saw as protecting their rights.
Then came the 1874 election in Barbour County. That sounds like a turning point.
A brutal one. Violence, intimidation, orchestrated by groups like the White League.
Targeting Black voters, Republican organizers.
Systematically. In places like Clayton and Eufaula. Threats against the Republican meeting. The shooting at Keel's store where his son was killed. It was violent suppression.
And federal troops.
Largely sidelined by restrictive orders. So the white Democrats won through force and intimidation. That was basically the end of Reconstruction in Barbour.
And the consequences.
Devastating. The rise of the convict lease system, mass disenfranchisement of Black voters, Jim Crow laws solidifying, white supremacy reasserted.
Tell me more about convict leasing.
It was horrific. Essentially a new form of forced labor, overwhelmingly targeting Black men, often for minor or fabricated offenses.
And it benefited.
Individuals like J.W. Comer, who leased convicts for his mines, and the state itself. The conditions for prisoners were brutal, deadly.
Were there any challenges to this? Peonage? Debt labor?
Judge Jones tried. He made some efforts against peonage, but faced huge systemic resistance.
Even with Supreme Court rulings like Bailey v. Alabama in 1911, which ruled against debt peonage.
Right, the ruling happened, but the federal will to actually dismantle the system on the ground just wasn't there.
Moving into the early 20th century, the fight over voting rights continued.
Oh, yes. The Lodge Bill, aimed at federal protection for Black voters, sparked fierce Southern opposition. States' rights, again.
And within Alabama.
You had movements like the Populists, with Reuben F. Kolb challenging the traditional Black Belt planter elite.
How was he received in places like Eufaula?
Hostilely. The established powers didn't like being challenged.
Then figures like William Jelks emerge.
Central to the disenfranchisement push, the 1901 Alabama Constitutional Convention was explicitly designed to get around the 15th Amendment.
To stop black people from voting without overtly saying it was about race.
Exactly. To codify white supremacy legally, make it seem orderly, less reliant on open violence, though violence was always underpinning it.
This post-slavery logic of white supremacy, how did it work?
It was framed almost democratically, a shared racial status for whites. White citizenship meant having power over black people who were effectively denaturalized. Freedom for one group was defined by the subjugation of another.
And lynching fits into this, like Ivor Peterson in Barbour County.
Precisely. Cowie describes Eufaula's finest citizens participating, the deputy doing nothing. It's presented as white freedom in action, the freedom to dominate, to kill with impunity.
A kind of popular constitutionalism where local white power ignored formal law.
Exactly. Their interpretation trumped everything else.
Let's jump ahead. The Great Depression hits. How did that affect Barbour County?
Like the rest of the South, it hit hard. Initially, there was some enthusiasm for FDR's New Deal programs.
Even from business elites.
Some, like Donald Comer, initially. But that support often cooled when federal programs started touching on race or labor practices. Resistance to federal intervention in those areas remained strong.
Then World War II. The Double V campaign victory abroad and at home. How did that play out?
Tensely. In places like mobile shipyards, white workers fiercely resisted black workers getting better jobs, even skilled ones.
Despite the war effort needing workers.
Yes, it eventually led to segregated shipways. Even a national crisis didn't overcome the local racial hierarchy easily.
Then the modern civil rights movement gains momentum. Brown v. Board.
A landmark legal victory, of course. But implementation on the ground, especially in places like Eufaula, was incredibly slow. Massive resistance.
And local conflicts erupted, like Albert Street in Eufaula.
Right. Black residents organizing against a redevelopment plan they saw as discriminatory, designed to displace them.
Was there federal help initially?
Not much. It highlighted the local power dynamics and the resistance to any kind of integration.
Fred Gray, the attorney, gets involved.
Yes, filing legal challenges. He even had surprising interactions with Judge George C. Wallace early on, arguing against discrimination in jury selection, laying groundwork.
And Wallace himself. His political rise was starting.
He learned quickly that in Alabama politics then, moderation was political suicide.
So he leaned into
mobilizing white voters against perceived enemies, the federal government, and implicitly or explicitly, African Americans demanding rights.
Which leads to his infamous stand in the schoolhouse door.
At the University of Alabama in '63, pure political theater, really. He stood there, made his point for the cameras, but ultimately stepped aside for federal authority, represented by Deputy A.G. Katzenbach.
But the symbolism was powerful for his supporters.
Immensely powerful. Then came the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
A huge legislative victory. A second Reconstruction, some called it.
A major step towards dismantling legal segregation and discrimination.
How did this '64 presidential election play out in the South?
Very tellingly, Barry Goldwater, running against Johnson, emphasized states' rights.
Which resonated strongly with white Southerners.
Yes, including in Barbour County. Many switched from Democrat to Republican in that election, supporting Goldwater precisely because of his perceived opposition to civil rights enforcement. A major political realignment begins.
Meanwhile, activists were on the ground in Barbour County.
Yes, SNCC. SELC, doing voter registration drives in the mid-'60s, like the Scope Project, facing intense resistance, of course.
Did local activism alone achieve breakthroughs?
It was essential, but federal power often made the difference. Hosea Williams put it bluntly. States' rights and civil rights don't mix. Federal registrars, federal court orders were often needed to overcome local obstruction.
Like Judge Frank Johnson's ruling.
Yes, in Smith v. Paris. He struck down the Barbour County Democrats' attempt to dilute the black vote by switching to at-large elections, a key legal intervention.
And people started running for office. Fred Gray himself ran for state representative in '66.
Showing the drive to turn those hard-won voting rights into actual political power and representation.
Wallace, though, took his message national.
He did. His appeal, based on this kind of racialized anti-government sentiment, found an audience far beyond Alabama.
It tapped into something broader, and the civil rights movement's strategy.
Often involved creating confrontations, like in Selma, precisely to force the federal government's hand, to make them intervene and enforce or even expand constitutional rights for black citizens, overriding state resistance.
Which connects to the Southern strategy in national politics.
Right. Politicians, notably Nixon later on, saw the potential in appealing to those white voters, often using coded language, who were uneasy about civil rights changes and federal power.
So this Wallace factor, it had a lasting impact.
Cowie argues it really did, that possibility of the North becoming Southernized in its political divisions, based partly on these tensions Wallace exploited.
Looking back at Barbour County's whole story then, freedom is, well, it's complicated.
Deeply contested. Always shaped by race, by power, and this constant push and pull between local control, often meaning white control, and federal authority.
We've seen how it's been defined to liberate some while oppressing others.
And how often federal power was necessary, even if imperfectly applied, to challenge that oppression and try to guarantee rights more broadly.
Which really leaves you, the listener, with a question, doesn't it?
It does. How do these deeply rooted historical ideas about freedom, power, and government, forged in places like Barbour County, still echo today?
How do they shape our current debates about rights, about who belongs, about the role of the state?
It's something to really think about.
Absolutely. If this discussion sparks some thoughts for you, please consider subscribing and maybe share it with someone else who might find it interesting.
And for a much deeper dive, definitely check out Jefferson Cowie's book, Freedom's Dominion. We'll put a link where you can find it.
Yes, please do. And most importantly, keep thinking critically about freedom, what it means, who it's for, and how its meaning continues to be shaped in our world today.